Hi, this is Eric Keller with ZBrush Jewelry Workshop. In this video, we're going to continue making the Dumbo Octopus ring using ZBrushCore 2021. So picking up where I left off in the previous video, the first thing I'm going to do is subdivide the model so I can start sculpting it. So press Ctrl D a few times and get it up to about 5.4 million. So you can see right here it says 5.4 million. And you can see here in the geometry subpalette, I have my subdivision slider, which allows me to go from the lowest subdivision level of 5,000 points to the highest subdivision level of 5 million points and all the subdivision levels in between. So I'm going to turn off polyframe. And now I'm going to switch my sculpting brush to the clay brush and increase my draw size and start to sculpt. And I'm just going to block out some of the details. So I want to bring the eyes back right here. Also, I'm going to sculpt the rest of the model asymmetrically because I think that'll be more fun. At this point, the legs are already asymmetrical. So I'm just using the sculpting brush, the clay brush, to kind of define these eyes, and I'm holding the Shift key to smooth it out every once in a while. If I go to a lower subdivision level, I can smooth a little bit stronger because I have a few polygons at that subdivision level. So I can go up here, smooth this out a little bit. Now the one piece of anatomy that I haven't added yet at this point, and I'm not going to, is the skirt or the webbing that goes between the tentacles, because I'm not absolutely sure this is the final position of the tentacles, and I think it'll be easier to finalize the sculpting of the tentacles first and then add that skirt in later as a separate piece of geometry that then can be fused into the whole piece. But like I said, I'm going to leave that for later. So I'm going to start just kind of blocking this out, giving a little bit more personality, not necessarily detail at this point, still kind of a sculptural block up, just something that is closer to looking more like an interesting sculpt. I'm going to move this down a little bit so that it's easier to smooth. And I'm holding the Shift key. I just realized I lowered my Z intensity on my smooth brush. I'm holding the Shift key and I'm going to increase the Z intensity. Now it should be, that's better. A lot of times when I'm sculpting, I'm constantly switching to the smooth brush while I sculpt to smooth everything out. I might actually make one eye significantly larger than the other. So I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do with those wing type deals. I'm still thinking about that while I work. These guys do tend to have a little vent back here, like a protrusion. So I'm using the move brush just to pull the points down and smoothing it out as I go. I'm just blocking it in. I'm not exactly sure the final pose if this is actually going to be visible or not though. So I'm using the move brush. I'm holding the Alt key and pushing in to kind of depress that area right there to kind of define that a little bit better. And I'll go into clay and make some more detail there. The clay brush is a great way to build up the surface. It's a very organic, natural feeling type brush. I'm going to go to the bottom with my clay brush, hold the Alt key and kind of flatten out the bottom here. Just to mimic the shape that you see on tentacles. And I can take the inflate brush and maybe inflate the side right here. And we will be adding some kind of suction cup at some point, but right now I'm just concerned. I consider that more detailing. Remember, this is a polygroup, so I can hold Ctrl and Shift and click on it to hide everything else. And that makes it much easier to work on this in isolation. I'm just going to inflate the end of it so that's not so pointy. Maybe add a few bumps and lumps just for visual interest. Go down lower subdivision level and smooth this out. So this is the huge advantage of subdivision levels, is because I can go all the way down here to the slowest subdivision level and smooth things. It just makes it much easier to keep things nice and neat. And in the higher levels, I have all that detail that I can work with. So you can go up and down between subdivision levels all day long, as long as you don't delete them. And there are reasons to delete and rebuild or eliminate subdivision levels during the process of sculpting. This is something that it takes some practice to learn when the most appropriate time to do that is. The main thing to understand is, since we have ZRemesher and Dynamesh and all these other things, it's very easy to constantly change and update and rebuild the topology of the model as needed. So it's not something that you need to stress out about necessarily. I think I'm just fattening out this tentacle, and then I'll Ctrl Shift click to bring everything back. And then with the inflate brush, I'm going to lower subdivision level. I'm going to make this a bit fatter over here. And then what I'm going to do is I want to move this, make this wrap around this tentacle again. So it's kind of lost something there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to lowest subdivision level, and I'm going to open up the sculpting brush palette and choose Move Topological. So what Move Topological does is it only moves the vertices that are connected to each other. So if I use my regular move brush and I try and move this, you can see it's moving the tentacle below it. If I switch to Move Topological, then I can move this tentacle and I can use it to kind of wrap the tentacle around like I had it before, making him look super cash, as octopuses tend to look. Not the angry octopuses that I see on other rings, but the super cash octopuses. That makes things easier. So the one thing that's important to understand about the Move Topological brush, and the reason I moved down to lowest subdivision level, is that every time I brush on this, it's looking at all the points that are connected. So if this is at a higher subdivision level, it has more points to look at with each stroke, and it tends to slow it down. It depends on your machine, but sometimes if you have it really high, and I try to use Move Topological, you can see it really, really lags. So in that case, at a higher subdivision level, I would just switch to the regular move brush. And then, of course, since we have polygroups, again, I'll press W for the move gizmo and hold Control and tap on this tentacle. Since that's its own polygroup, you can see now it's masked. The only thing is that this border of the mask is very sharp. So I'm going to hold Control. Let's switch back to Draw. I'm going to switch back to Draw, hold Control, and tap on this a few times to blur the edge of that mask so it's not so sharp. And then what I can do is we'll go in here with the inflate brush. This is just another way to kind of do what I was doing before. It's just another approach. The nice thing about this is that I can see the rest of the model while I'm fattening this up, this tentacle. The mask persists. If I go to a lower subdivision level, it's still there. So I can go all the way to the lowest subdivision level and use my Move Topological to curl this guy around. So once again, this is ZBrushCore, so it's not quite as many features as you'll find in the regular ZBrush. In the regular ZBrush, you actually have a slider called Mask by Polygroup that I use a lot that allows you to manipulate each polygroup independently without having to use Move Topological. It's a really cool feature. And I'm just going to go through and do the same kind of thing for the other tentacles. Okay, so I've taken some time to actually pose the rest of the tentacles using the same techniques that I've been demonstrating. So there's nothing special here, just other than just twisting and pushing and pulling until I get kind of the shape that I want. As I go to the higher subdivision levels, you can see I used different brushes to start to bring in kind of secondary forms, kind of bulges, as well as this kind of groove that we have at the bottom tentacle. So I have one last tentacle to do, so I wanted to just kind of show you a little bit about how I'm going about doing this. So inflate brush is really great for creating a kind of bulge. that you see. And then if I go down to lower subdivision level, I really wanted to get a nice little curl in here to get some personality. So again, move topological, just, you know, kind of pushing it around like this. Because one thing I want to make sure that I do is that I am going to be making suction cups, and suction cups are such a huge part of the octopus personality. They're one of the things that make octopuses look so cool, right? So I want to make sure that that's visible in the final design. So I want to make sure that I have my tentacles twisting around in various different ways so that I can kind of show the underside of the tentacle. So that's just my thinking right there. And as you can see, I'm just kind of moving and inflating and smoothing. It's just kind of repeat until it looks right, you know, do it till it's right. And then to create that kind of groove, so I'm gonna get just a little bit more personality in here. No, something like that. Anyways, to get that groove in the bottom, I'll go to a higher subdivision level, like say subdivision level 4. And I'm gonna hold Ctrl and Shift and click on that just to isolate it. And then I'm gonna use the clay brush. I'm just pressing S to bring up the hotkey so I can change my draw size. And then I'm gonna hold the Alt key and just kind of brush this groove in here. And I wanna make sure, I'm gonna start from the beginning and the end and then figure out where they should join up in the middle. But I definitely want this part facing outwards so that I can add some cool suction cups in just a few moments. So this is definitely my favorite part of the ZBrush sculpting process, because this is where your shape starts to bring out life, and it's also kind of the payoff, because this kind of sculpting process for me is very pleasant. So this is the payoff for all the prep work that we've done in the previous chapter, setting up the polygroups and all that kind of dry technical stuff. It's very worth it to do that kind of stuff, even though it's not as much fun. When you get to the process where you're actually sculpting, you can worry about sculpting and you have fewer things getting in the way of that process. So creating subdivision levels, which I know, you know, I keep saying as if you have a choice. Well, you do have a choice. A lot of people use, you know, a lot of ZBrush artists work different ways. So it's very popular sometimes to use Dynamesh or a sculptor's mode to kind of just sculpt without paying attention to the point count or the subdivision level, just kind of sculpt directly. And that's fine, but I think there are advantages, especially when you want to do something as precise as jewelry can be, to having those subdivision levels, because it allows you to do things like go down here and smooth this just to knock it back a little bit faster and to keep it kind of a nice clean surface. And then also with the flexibility of the higher subdivision levels and adding detail there. But this is an approach, or it's a school of thought, I should say. It's not a technical requirement. It's just an approach to sensible sculpting with ZBrush, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, just get a little lumpy there. Okay, so I'm going to press Ctrl Shift, click on a blank part of the canvas, and bring back the rest of the octopus. Keep in mind, I can also, I'm going to switch to the gizmo. You can press W to do that. Hold the Control key and just tap on this just to mask everything but this part of the model. That's just as opposed to hiding it. You could do it either way. And then I'm going to press Q for the draw mode. Use my move brush and just kind of get rid of this intersection there so it looks a little bit more believable. And maybe get the inflate brush. I think the groove is a little bit overdone there. And then I'm going to use this just to shape it, make it sort of tubular as possible. Okay, so now let's talk about suction cups. So I'm going to Ctrl Drag and release to clear the mask, and I'm at subdivision level 6. So there's lots of different ways you can do suction cups. I'm going to show a nice simple way that produces pretty good results for this particular model. So if we go to an underside here, I always like to pick a part of the model and do a little bit of testing here. So I'm going to switch to clay buildup. So the difference between clay buildup and clay is if I use the regular clay brush and I start drawing, you can see I keep drawing and then it kind of stops at a certain point until I start drawing again. All right, so you can just overlap strokes to build up the surface, right? So with clay buildup, the main difference is it has a square alpha, which I'll get to in a second, but the buildup part means that as I keep brushing on the surface, it keeps pushing out more and more, just like I'm layering a stroke. So the square alpha is what gives the clay buildup brush its shape. So as I just make strokes on the surface, you can see it has that kind of square shape to it, right? So if I turn the alpha off, then it doesn't have that shape. It's a bit more like the standard clay brush. So you can choose other alphas in here, of course. If we wanted to do something more suction cup-like, we could try alpha 26, which is this one right here. So then I can kind of like literally build out a nice little suction cup that way. That's one way to go about doing it. Another way is you could use drag dot and increase the Z intensity. So if I drag this right here, you can see that way your suction cups are always going to be exactly the same size, which might be a stylistic choice. They look exactly the same. So this one has a little bit more of natural variation because I'm drawing like this, where this one I'm just kind of placing them. It's very fast and you might want stylistically that kind of consistency. You could also use the drag rect, which means that as I pull out, I can have it in different sizes. The downside of this one is it can be a little bit weak. What you can try doing though is a trick where if I make a stroke mark on the surface and I press the 1 key on my keyboard, it repeats the last stroke. So every time I press 1, it builds it out a little bit more. So that's one way of doing it. I don't know, this to me doesn't look as good as the other versions though. But it's something you can try. With that 1 key trick, you have to be aware that it's going to repeat whatever the last action was. So if I make a mark on the surface, right, and then I press 1, it's going to redo that mark. Every time I press 1, it's going to redo that mark. But if I do something like move the view, every time I press 1, it's going to move the view. So just keep that in mind when you're using it to repeat brush strokes. Just make sure you make the brush stroke and then press 1 repeatedly until you're done, rather than making a brush stroke, rotating the camera, and then pressing 1, because you'll get that. I'm going to go into the edit menu here and move the undo counter down a bit. So to undo all that stuff, it's just a bit easier to move the slider sometimes than it is to hit Ctrl Z over and over again. The thing is that you have to kind of figure out where in the history you actually were. So I blocked out the basic suction cups for the tentacles on all of the tentacles except for this one, because I want to show you the basic workflow that I'm using. But before I do that, I just wanted to point out, I'm not going to get too hung up on getting them perfect right now, because I can always fix stuff later on, as we'll see in later videos. So the fact that we see this kind of stretching and tessellation right here, I'm not going to worry about that right now, because we can fix it later on. So we just want to get them into place. Most of the tentacles, they look nice and smooth. There's just a few spots where the tentacle has been stretched that are a problem. There is a tendency when you're first starting out with ZBrush to try and get things look perfect when you're zoomed in like this close, but that's not really a good use of time, because it's never going to be perfect. The closer you get, the worse it's going to look. And in reality, we're never going to be seeing the jewelry from that close anyways in the finished product. Okay, so what I did for each one of these tentacles, since we have our polygroups, as you can see, I'm going to hold Ctrl and Shift, click on this last tentacle here to isolate it, so I don't have to worry about the other one. So I'll turn off the polyframe button there. Using clay buildup with alpha 26, Z intensity V around 11, and a medium draw size. And I'm just going in here and just drawing these on really quickly. And I'm kind of following the groove pattern that I created earlier. There's lots of different approaches to doing this, as I mentioned before, so it's always good to experiment and kind of never do it exactly the same way twice whenever I do one of these tentacled critters. Lower the draw size a little bit just to make smaller ones. That's too much. You know, in the full version of ZBrush, of course, there's probably a dozen more different ways you could go about creating suction cups like this. You could use like nano mesh or the insert mesh brushes. ZBrushCore does have an insert mesh brush. It's not quite as powerful as a full version of ZBrush because you can't make your own insert meshes, but it is pretty cool. Now I'm going to hold Ctrl and Shift, tap on a blank part of the canvas, bring back the whole octopus, and now we have our tentacles with basic suction cups added. So in the next video, we're going to detail this and improve on the look here. But now we've got almost everything in place. Turn off the solo button, and you can see its position on the ring. Okay, so next video, we're going to get into detailing.